That may have been Watershed Council. Well, yeah, we did. Nice to meet you. Yeah, same. Or. Max, how are you? Yeah, how you doing? Good to see you as well. How you doing? Good. Very good. Yeah, that's cool, man. Good to see you. Yeah. You've been out, haven't been out this year. He's doing well. He's retired.
How's things?
Just a couple clients and spent the whole.
All right, everybody, I think we're gonna get started if you all would like to have a seat. Holly, do we have folks online? Is there any way to make sure they? Oh, do I need to stand up at a podium?
Yeah.
Ooh.
You have some mics too.
Okay.
Oh, you have.
Oh man, I'm a walker. I would love a microphone because I can't stay still, so that'd be fantastic. Oh, okay. All right. Awesome. Maybe more this way. Okay, sorry, we're just getting set up here so we can make sure that people can see me because I wouldn't want them to miss out on this. So anyway, thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Ben Steyerman. I'm the Deputy Director at the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, and I oversee the lands and minerals aspect of the division. So that's what we're here to talk about tonight is both the Great Salt Lake and Utah Lake management plans along with the mineral leasing plan for Great Salt Lake. So we update these plans about every 10 years, and we're just kicking off that process now. So we're trying to gather input from folks like you, from our partners and other stakeholders to find out how we can do better and make sure that we're managing it in a way that's cohesive with, again, our partners' efforts and the needs of the public. I think it's really important to start this off by just mentioning, this resource is managed under the public trust doctrine. Our division, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, has been charged with managing sovereign lands in the state of Utah. But the reason we manage these is because they were navigable at the time of statehood, and there's this kind of not black and white letter law, but this doctrine out there that says that these resources belong to the people. That's like the air we breathe. They can't be owned or privatized, so they belong to you, and we're just the managers. So you all own them. We're managing them. This is again why we really value the public input, is because we want to know how we can manage them well and reflect well on what your desires are, as well as those of our partners and the needs of the lake. So historically, our management plans have acted much like a zoning document. So they say, what's allowable on the lakes, what's not allowable. And that's really the extent of where they've left off. They also have kind of like a NEPA style report that goes over, the ecological assessment of the lake, the resources, the history, and all of that's great. And I don't think that we shouldn't have that out there. However, I don't know that the NEPA style document necessarily belongs into our management plans. We're hoping that these will be a little bit more adaptive. So I don't know that I need to retell the story of Lake Bonneville. I think that story has remained the same for thousands of years, and we hope to keep it the same, but also refer to other places where we can tell that story, and then have our management plan be a place where we can go to be iterative, and as we learn new things about these resources, because we are still learning, we don't know everything about Great Salt Lake, obviously, or Utah Lake. And so as we learn, we can apply those lessons to our management plans and to those resources. So we hope to be able to have something that's much more adaptive. We also want to build off of the resources that are there. So if you look back, you'll see the fuzzy matrix, and I know Jeff is going to talk a little bit about this, but these elevation matrices matrices are things that you have, if you've been involved in the Great Salt Lake, you probably have seen that around. and it's been a really valuable tool in trying to assess the health of Great Salt Lake. But one of the things that we would like to see with this new plan is how we can use those tools to better manage. So take it a step further and say, okay, when the lake hits this level, what can we be doing to manage when the lake is at this level, and be both reactive and proactive? So if we start to forecast the lake is going to get into certain paradigms, what can we be doing? And we're not the only agency working on Great Salt Lake. I see folks here from the Water Trust. I see the Utah Lake Authority. We have so many people who work in this realm. Our nonprofit partners, our other government partners, the general public even. So how can we coordinate our efforts? I think that's also what we'd like to figure out here in this plan is how we make sure that when we hit certain thresholds or certain lake levels, salinity levels, again, how can we be reactive and proactive and make those connections and leverage resources with our partners? So those are a lot of the things that we're hoping to achieve in this plan. I could probably talk about this all night, but I think it's better to let Jeff go through the slides, and then I'll be around to help answer questions and go a little more. Or excuse me, I'm going to let Dan kick it off, and then I'll stick around and answer questions as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Okay. Just real quick for the folks online, just letting you know how to participate. So we're using Zoom webinar. So we can't see you, but you can comment or ask questions through the chat function. No, sorry, the Q&A function on Zoom webinar. So, and there's a little Q&A on the bottom of the screen to do that. If you have any questions, Holly here on our team is at the computer and we'll see those. When we get to the end, we'll go through and do a Q&A, and we'll grab those folks online then too. Okay.
Great, thank you, Dan. My name is Jeff Denblaker. I work with Jacobs Engineering, and our team at Jacobs and Langdon Group and some others were contracted to help the Division of Forestry, Fire and State Lands complete these plans. And what I'm hoping to do here with you is just walk you through some of the, let's see, sorry, my slides aren't moving forward like they're supposed to. Hold on just a second. Let me see what's going on here. So I think as Ben was saying, I don't know why that's.
All right, everybody.
There we go. There we go. All right. It was paused somehow. Thanks, Ben. So as Ben said, these plans have typically been updated about every 10 years, and there's several of them that we're doing here, both the mineral leasing plan and the comprehensive management plan for Great Salt Lake, and then the comprehensive management plan for Utah Lake. And I think it's important, Ben used some big words there, and I think it's important for us to define some of these things because they're important for these plans. As you can see, the Division of Forestry, Fire and State Lands, we find a lot of people wonder, who are they? What do they do? And they are a division who's responsible for, in this case, managing sovereign lands. They do a number of other things with forest health, responding to wildland fires as well. But the key words here are sovereign lands. And for these two lakes, the key feature here is we're looking at, is that we're looking at this, we're only going to be studying the land below the ordinary high water mark of these lakes. So for Great Salt Lake, we use the word meander line. This is they look at where the water was at statehood, and so over the years that has been surveyed, it's been decided by courts throughout the years since statehood, and so that actually varies in elevation from I think 4208 up to 4212. And Utah Lake, we have another line that has been determined over the years and adjudicated by the courts. And so what we're looking at with the study are the sovereign lands which are below that. So it's inside the lake, and we're looking at the ground below the water. When we talk about public trust, Ben talked about that. The state is the trustee of these state lands, but the beneficiary is you, it's all of us. And so what that means is that the state really needs to work to manage those resources in a way that balances all of the different uses and protects those and make sure that they're sustainable. And those principles, we use the words multiple use, sustainable yield principles. And so Forestry Fire State Lands, as the trustee, is directed by the code to manage these in a way where we balance all the different uses and make sure that we can sustain those resources for future generations. So just briefly, some background. I think what's exciting about these two projects, I think, is really the collaborative history. I think they're both in different places. I know I started working with Great Salt Lake about 20 years ago, and 20 years ago, things were very different. Agencies really weren't talking much with each other. There was a lot of distrust between different stakeholders, and it was challenging to wrestle with complicated problems. And I think today we're in a very different paradigm. There's always room for improvement, but agencies are working very closely with each other. I think stakeholders, NGOs, industry have worked together closely on a number of very complicated, contentious issues to try to find solutions. And I think, as you can see here, there's a lot going on Great Salt Lake. There's a lot of studies that are underway, shown on this diagram, that have been proposed, and they're all connected. And I think the two big ones here that you see is the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan that the Division of Water Resources is doing. They're really focusing on the water from the watershed, how much water is available in the watershed, how much is needed by the watershed, by Great Salt Lake. This comprehensive management plan for Great Salt Lake is really looking at, once the water is in the lake, now how do we manage the resources within the lake? So there's a slight distinction there. If you look at, one's looking upstream, one's really looking at the lake. But both of these studies are funneling in and informing the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's strategic plan. And he published one last year and this past year, and he's currently working on updating and developing a 30-year plan right now. But I think if you're familiar with Great Salt Lake, a lot has happened just in the last 10 years. With the all-time record low water level that we saw new features that emerged from the lake. We saw a lot of media attention, not just here locally, but across the world. We've seen an explosion, or really a huge interest in the resources of the lake, specifically with lithium. I think the legislature has passed significant legislation just in the last 2 years, really revamping the rules for mineral extraction from Great Salt Lake. We saw a salinity crisis, and we saw a lot of agencies and partners working together to try to avert the crisis that we had with high salinities in the South Arm. And then just most recently, just seeing a lot of pressure. Well, we've seen a lot of development pressure along the shoreline, but we've seen in the news a lot of attention with the inland port proposals around the lake. So there's been a lot of change around Great Salt Lake. And I think the same is, we see the same kind of thing around Utah Lake. And I think with Utah Lake, there's been a lot of attention there as well over the years. And I think especially over the last 5 years, I'd say, I guess my experience has been seeing just a significantly more coordination and spearheaded by the Utah Lake Authority to bring people together to understand the resources and just to coordinate all the different activities that are there. And here you can see a number of the studies that have been ongoing. The Utah Lake Authority finished their Utah Lake Management Plan just this past January. We're starting this Utah Lake Comprehensive Management Plan now. And then there's a number of other studies that are in the wings or are underway that will be informing both of these studies. The need here is also great. The last time the Utah Lake Management Plan was updated was in 2009, so that's more than 10 years if you do your math. But in the intervening years, we've seen significant efforts for carp removal, significant efforts to restore the June sucker, successful efforts. We've seen a lot of attention on harmful algal blooms in Utah Lake. We saw the proposal for islands and development within the lake. A lot of work done by the Utah Lake Commission. Division of Water Quality has done a lot of work on the Utah Lake water quality studies to try to address nutrients and harmful algal blooms. New proposals for development along the shoreline, and right now, a lot of it being wrangled by the Utah Lake Authority. So, if we look at what the world looked like in 2009 in Utah Lake, and as it looks like today, it's vastly different. And so that really presents the need to update these plans, to be able to provide forestry, fire, and state lands with a playbook as to how they can best manage the resources there. I think an important question that we often get is, are these plans going to handle water rights? Are they going to handle getting water to these lakes? Are we going to be providing provisions for how to manage fisheries or water quality? And I think the answer here is that we're not going to be focusing on those specific issues. Forestry, Fire, and State Lands has a number of partners, a lot of other agencies whose objective and their responsibility are for those issues. And Forestry, Fire, and State Lands needs to coordinate and work with all their partners to be able to make informed decisions on how to manage the different resources within the lake. So the intent is not to duplicate or to replicate or replace the work that others are already doing, but to try to understand what they're doing and to make sure that all of these different cogs are working together, these different parts are working well together. So what the plan does is these plans are going to make sure that's clear as to what Forestry, Fire, and State Lands authority is, what their role is. It's going to identify strategies, how they make decisions to manage all the different resources of these lakes. And I guess to summarize, it's going to tell us what we can and we can't do in the lake. And I think in my mind, I see it really as kind of their playbook. What can and can't they do? So Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, and a lot of the work that they do, when they get proposals for people who want to do something in the lake, they have to review those proposals, and then they issue permits, leases, or easements just based upon the land uses within those lakes. What you see here for Utah Lake, there in the picture on the right, is their land use classification map. And there's different classes that provide guidance as to what can and can't occur within those areas. It's very similar to what most cities have zoning maps. So they have different parts of the city that are zoned for high density residential areas or commercial or industrial and things like that. So similarly here, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands develops a land classification map for each of these lakes to help guide them into what can and can't occur in different parts of the lake. And then that helps guide their regulatory reviews for those proposals. So these management plans guide them. They help define the goals and definitions, make sure that everything's transparent helps guide them, make sure it's clear to their staff, but also to the public. They helps them contribute to the overall management, sustainable management of the resources of the lake, coordinate with the other agencies, ensures that the ecological health, the scenic attributes, industries, recreation opportunities can be maintained now, but also into the future. We need to balance all of these things so that they're sustainable. And then I think one of the biggest challenges, or a significant challenge, I should say, is just reflecting the changes that are happening and reflecting the new data, the new science that's being conducted along the way, and make sure that these plans can adapt along with the conditions that are happening. And to do that, they really need to coordinate with everybody. So just some of the examples of some of the issues or proposals that they get that Forestry, Fire, and State Lands manages. Certainly on Great Salt Lake are mineral leases. People lease the land as well for, I think from Great Salt Lake, the most obvious example are the mineral extraction ponds. They're big evaporation ponds. They lease those lands, utility crossings, grazing out on the shorelines on state land, shoreline enhancements, Phragmites control, I think, is a significant effort that Forestry, Fire, and State Lands has taken the lead on and has been getting the funding and implementing those activities. Filming, people who want to film movies, dredging activities, commercial fisheries such as brine shrimp on Great Salt Lake, and then salinity management. I think, I was asking them, where are some of the distinctions as to where, how do you know when you should get permission from the state to do something? And I think one example is just, if there's money involved, then for sure, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands needs to be involved. And I guess a simple example is if you wanted to have a bonfire on, a little campfire on the shoreline of Great Salt Lake. If it was just you and your family or a few friends, that's one thing. But if you're starting to charge a cover charge, for people to come out to your event, then you most likely need to have a permit to do something like that.
Just also interject, campfires are actually illegal on the
Illegal? Okay, that's not a good example. A picnic. So no fires on the lakes. Not that I've ever done that. But I think one of the challenges that we see looking back over the last 10, 15 years is Forestry, Fire, and State Lands gets new proposals all the time. And as comprehensive as their past plans have been, they get, probably the majority of their proposals are things that weren't even contemplated when those plans were written. And so one of their biggest challenges is how can the plan adapt with change? As new technology happens, or Great Salt Lake water levels fell, and so that opens a whole new cadre of opportunities where people come up with new ideas. And and Ben would love to have the magic crystal ball to be able to foresee what kinds of things people might propose. But what we really need to do is really need to focus on, well, what are the things that matter? What are the resources we're trying to protect? What are the uses we need to protect? What are the things that we can control? As far as this plan goes, we can't, we're not controlling the water coming into the lake. That's being handled by other agencies. But with the water that we have in the lake, what can we do to maximize or protect the resources and maximize the uses? And so what we want to do is really try to focus upon the things that intersection between what we control and what's most important. And I think when we look at plans that are sustainable, that are resilient to all of the pressures and changes, we really look at three things. One is we need to be aware of what's happening. We need to be, for Great Salt Lake or even Utah Lake, how's the water level changing? Because a whole lot of different things happen when we see those changes. So we need to be consistently aware of what the situation is. What does it mean? I think the lake level matrix for Great Salt Lake is a great example of where we can see very simply on that chart, at a certain lake level, we can see if we're in a green zone, if we're in an orange zone, or if we're in a red zone. So being aware of where we are, but what does it mean? And then what are we going to do about it? And so we want to have a plan that can provide some sideboards, understand what are our intended outcomes, what do we want to have at the end of the day, and then be able to adapt as these lakes change. And so one way that we are planning to do that is to try to transition away from the big tome, the big paper reports to bring the information online. And so right now you can actually go for each lake, there's a separate website where you can access this information for each lake. So this is the Great Salt Lake homepage. There's a lot of information about those plans for the Great Salt Lake. There's a section for frequently asked questions and then a public participation portal. talk about the other two a little bit later, but I think this is an important place to go to keep up to speed with what we're doing and also be able to participate. And as we develop the plan will reside on this website. So we'll be adding additional tabs so people can more easily access the information there, but also be able to understand how changes are influencing decisions. This is a concept that we have just as an example. This concept is for Great Salt Lake and just specifically looking at salinity. But the example here is just to be able to understand, if we know we can easily link to information on where the lake level is. We think and we're working on a way to be able to make sure we can also keep the current salinity of the lake on the website. But then we can easily, from a matrix like this, we can see where we are with our salinity. Are we in a green zone, yellow, orange, red zone? What does that mean? And then also be able to then see, based on that salinity, have some triggers to tell us, okay, here are the kinds of strategies that we need to be working on now for the next 3 months, 6 months, maybe a year or two out, to try to anticipate, well, what should we be doing now to be prepared for these changes that are coming up. So that's a concept that we're working on right now for the management plans. Some of the potential focus areas, and I guess this is the area that we hope to hear. I think this is the most important thing at this point that we want to hear from the public, from our partners, is what areas should we be focusing on? And these are just examples that you can see here on the screen of areas that we're already looking at, that we're planning to address as part of these plans. But we want to make sure we understand what's important to you. What concerns do you have? What resources do you think we need to make sure we protect? What uses should we be addressing? And again, here we're trying to anticipate what kinds of things might people want to propose. And so we can try to make sure we dial these plans in to address that. In terms of our process and timeline, this fall, what we've been doing is just reviewing a lot of the existing plans, information, talking to a lot of people. I think these public meetings that we've had over the last month and a half or so have been an important part of this to gather information. I'm also going to talk in a minute about a survey that you can access from each of these websites for each lake, where we hope you can answer some specific questions that we have there and help us identify what your concerns, issues, ideas are, so we can address those. We're already just starting to transition into developing the plans, starting to put pen to paper, trying to develop the outline, the framework for the plan so that it's something that can adapt over the future. And then with the goal of, by next fall, having a draft plans. And then we'll, at that point, start another public engagement process where those draft documents will be made available for review. We'll have public meetings. We want to make sure that we dial these, we get these plans right. And so your input now is helping us set the trajectory for the plan. As we develop the plan, we want to continue to get input on what's important. We'll be talking to people to discuss different ideas and strategies. But then when we get the draft document, we want to make sure that we've addressed everybody's concerns and ideas. And so we'll be incorporating comments and finalizing the plan being spring of 2026. So I think what became very apparent to us that there's no way we can do this alone. And I don't think we want to do this alone. If we do this, in our closed box, we know we're going to miss things, and it's not going to be the plan it needs to be. So I think it's critical that we work with our partners, not just. And this is a diagram for Great Salt Lake that the Great Salt Lake Commissioner put together, and you can see there's 9, I think, state agencies, 5 federal partners, and then a number of different other efforts by NGOs and others, just working on Great Salt Lake. And I know, with Utah Lake is probably just as complicated in terms of, well, I think I shouldn't say complicated. There's just as much interest there. And I would almost say that the trajectory there is really ramping up with more and more people wanting to engage on Utah Lake. And so there's a lot of different people that we hope to hear from, that we hope to work with in developing these plans. So I mentioned frequently asked questions. I think, we tried to, with a lot of the questions we've heard, we've tried to put some thought into answers for those, to put those on the online. Hopefully that's helpful for you. But then I think in terms of how you can engage, these meetings like you're attending today have been an important part of this. You can also email or mail comments at those addresses that you see there. Emily Hawley is the Forestry, Fire, and State Lands project manager. And so she's happy to take your emails, or if you want to put something through the Postal Service, we can do that. I think we hope that the websites are an easy way for you to access information and to be able to reach out to us as well. And the QR codes for both lakes are there. On each of those is a survey. And I guess that's our primary request right now is, if you haven't done the survey already, please do. Please go to the website. It's under the public participation portal. And I think there's 7 questions there for you to just help us understand better what the issues are, what your concerns are. And you can also, as part of that, you can actually, we love this as well, as you can go onto a map and you can drop a pin at specific locations if you want to. This is an area that, my favorite spot on this lake that, I hope we can protect this area, or we really need public access at this location, or, there's a huge problem in this location. Those are the kinds of things that we would love for you that kind of information to pass along there. You can also leave comments on the website, and there you can leave as much as you want there, or you can also call us. And so I think that kind of gives you an overview of what we're doing. I think what I really emphasized here were the comprehensive management plans for the 2 lakes. We're also developing a mineral leasing plan for Great Salt Lake, and that was last updated in 2013 as well. And what that does is really just helps provide the state with guidelines, make sure it's transparent for everybody as to how the minerals on the lake are leased and what the procedures are for that. And I know that's going to be leaning heavily on the legislation that was just passed in the last 2 years. So I think with that, wanted to open it up for questions. And we have a number of people here from our team. And so if you're online, please, type your questions in, and Holly will be sure to ask those. And anybody here have a question? Jamie, could you help with the microphone? Does anybody have a question here? Yeah.
Appreciate the overview. This has been really helpful. I am curious, with the Inland Port Authority, what the relationship is between FFLS and that group, because they seem to be operating pretty independently without a lot of public transparency. And I'm curious how forestry interacts with them, and particularly with the plan expected to be done a year from now. There'll be a lot more progress with the Inland Port than what will be, it'll be kind of like an afterthought in terms of what is going to be in the plan. So Can you talk about how forestry is interacting with that organization, and what kinds of, influence and interaction you have?
Yeah. I think the Inland Port, most of that land is outside of, well, it is all outside the sovereign lands. But I don't.
Yeah. So as Jeff mentioned, it is all outside of sovereign lands. And I think that's a great place for it to be. Sovereign lands are typically protected from that type of development. So Jeff's example of having that in there is really to draw that there's quite a bit of attention to Great Salt Lake. Some of these things have really piqued attention. As a department, though, we're heavily engaged with the Inland Port Authority due to the potential impacts on wetlands and analysis of those things. So we do stay engaged, but not in this plan. You won't probably see anything that's related to the Port Authority.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that we want to be certainly help inform our process is, there is a meander line, there's a legal boundary that we're working within, but we recognize that that's not there's a lot of land, a lot of uses, a lot of resources that are directly abut to that, and certainly the ecosystem doesn't care where that line is, and so I think the plan is intended to address the sovereign lands within that boundary, but as part of our process is we're contacting all of the property owners around that are abut up to the sovereign lands to make sure that they're aware of what we're doing, so that we can coordinate efforts and make sure that they're aware of the resources that we're trying to protect on sovereign lands. And
Say one other thing about that. One other thing that I also think is important, whether it's the Inland Port Authority or any upland landowner, as Jeff mentioned, with these lines that sometimes separate the meander line from the upland, the wetlands don't stop or the habitat doesn't stop. And so one of the other goals that we would like to, accomplish with this plan is how we connect those partnerships and manage across those jurisdictional boundaries. We have a great relationship with the Division of Wildlife Resources where we do that constantly. So if there was an opportunity with if an Inland Port Authority developed some land and there was some opportunity for us to be able to help benefit the Great Salt Lake by helping them, with their wetlands or invasive species or something I would be all about that. I think that's, they're obviously going to have to do what they have to do. And there's decision making that happens outside of, this plan. But if there's a clear line to how we can help protect and enhance the lake, and we can do those things in partnership or leverage resources from other places, we'll absolutely look across the line to see where we can do that.
great. Yep.
My name is Jared. I'm from Vineyard. I'm just a citizen. And but the LRS thing is kind of looms large for a lot of folks down there, me in particular. I'm wondering, since that effort failed, what considerations or additional insight could be has been gained about preventing things like that from happening again, and how that might figure into a future plan.
Great question. Just to clarify, you're talking about the island development of islands on Utah Lake proposal, correct? So I think one of the key things about this plan is to, we're trying to capture as many ideas of what people think would be helpful for the lake, and I know, as you with that example, that was an example that was proposed by people who thought that would be good for the lake. And so what we need to do is be able to identify, well, what are the processes by which proposals like that would need to be evaluated? What are the guidelines? What are the sideboards? What are the rules that govern those kinds of uses? How would they be evaluated against the resources of those lakes? Because we need to be able to balance. We need to be able to sustain and protect the resources of these lakes. And in this case, I think with that islands proposal, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands deemed it unconstitutional. Is that correct? Yes. I want to make sure I got it right. And so that was where that proposal stopped. And a big reason for that was that it was providing these sovereign lands for that private use. And And so I think as, you know, as proposals come in, I mean, Forestry, Fire and State Lands gets proposals all the time for, you know, new outfalls to the lakes, you know, people who want to do good things along the shoreline, people who want to who need to put a utility or they need to access, and I think one of the key functions of these comprehensive management plans is to make it clear, here's what you can and can't do. Here are things that, here are areas where the state is willing to entertain proposals. Here are the guidelines that they need to use to evaluate those proposals. And so I think that's what these plans are intended to do. It's just to make it all the information available for everybody, and make it open and transparent, and then facilitate an open process in evaluating those proposals. So, yep. Any online, Holly?
Yeah, we've got a few questions online. The first one is, how confident are you that we will not be forced to cut the lake in half to save one half? What are the thresholds that trigger action that are being discussed to avoid this problem again?
Great question.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you say that into the microphone so our online viewers? Okay, awesome. So I think the question was ultimately whether the lake could be cut in half, if that's on the palette, or if that's something that could be feasible. And I would just say that, you know, in the case of, they didn't refer to Great Salt Lake or Utah Lake, so I'll say in the case of Great Salt Lake, the lake already is divided by a causeway. This causeway is not something that would likely to be permitted today. I think it's a different paradigm today than it is, but now that we're dependent on a causeway, I think that if we were to somehow magically get rid of the causeway, we'd have some real problems in the South Arm as it relates to salinity and the ecosystem. So we're making the best that we can out of the situation and managing salinity, and it's actually kind of haphazardly become a real tool to be able to manage the salinity, and without it, we'd likely be much higher in the South Arm. So I suppose we got kind of lucky on that one, but as we look at Utah Lake, I would say it's very, you know, again, very unlikely that we would ever sacrifice one half of the lake to save the other half. Our goal is always to treat these resources as a whole and manage them, you know, uniformly across the board. So we're treating Utah Lake the same, whether it's on the south side or the north side. We also treat, you know, Bear Lake the same as we do Utah Lake. We're not going to sacrifice one resource to save another. But in the case of, you know, Great Salt Lake, where we've raised the berm before, we also are willing to do hard things and make decisions that are hard in order to deal with emergency situations. And as we saw the lake hit its lows, raising the berm was the right thing to do. We sent 200 million tons of salt to the North Arm with that, and our salinity's in a really good spot right now. So I think that was the right thing to do, but I'd like to avoid having to, you know, we don't want to reduce the North Arm. You know, the Gunnison Island is important. There's all kinds of resources that exist. So we want to treat the lake as a whole the best we can, but we'll certainly look to the tools that we have available if we ever get to the point of hitting a crisis like that again.
Okay. We have another question from online. Once the plan is in place, how much funding will forestry have to implement any changes, and over how many years?
That's another great question. The plan doesn't create any funding sources for us. So if we identify shortfalls in funding or gaps in the funding, or, you know, if there's management actions that would need funding, we would have to go request that from the legislature. But we have had great luck due to some policy changes that happened several years ago, where all of the revenue that we create on sovereign lands get prioritized back to the sovereign lands in which they were generated, or that's kind of how they're prioritized. But essentially, we're somewhat self-funded, so we have fairly good luck being able to acquire funding for the things that we've needed. We've been able to invest into wetland enhancements, Phragmites control, quite a few great projects with the funding that's generated. So I'm pretty confident that if we come up with some needs in the comprehensive management plan to fund, that we could go seek those funding sources and be successful with that.
Yeah, Marcel.
That's okay. Thanks, Jamie. Yes, I have a question. So, given the fact that, things have changed over the last 10 years plus, and that's part of this plan, how will you look towards actually potentially drafting any rule changes to go with that? Will that come after the management plan? How will that work?
But Marcel, that's a great question because it's one of those chicken and egg things, right? Do you do the plan before the rules or the rules after the plan? Typically, our rules trickle down from the statute, and the plans actually are a product of the rules and the statute culminate in the plan. So we try to capture all of that in the plan, how our rules play into what's allowable and what's not allowable, how we process things. So I don't think any of those things are would likely be, there's probably not any substantive changes on the books for the rules that would drastically change what we do in the plan. But I do think, having been in our division for a few years, we have new leadership, Jamie Barnes, who's our director, and has been really supportive in finding innovative ways to change and improve our division. I'm under the impression that almost every set of our rules will need to be touched in one way or another over the next few years. We've already started the process, working on some of our mineral rules, some of the newly published rules for the what was a result of HB 453 also impacted some of our existing rules that needed to be changed as well. So we've started the process and we'll continue through the process. And again, the adaptive nature of the plan, hopefully we can keep up, and as the rules change, we can modify the plans if needed. But I think we'll continue, and I think there's like our grazing rules. We're triaging at this point which rules need to come first. But I do think there's going to be some changes to come, and we'll certainly work through the public process to make sure anybody who's interested will have a chance to comment on those as well.
Would you think it's safe to say that as we go through developing these plans, and if we identify where rule changes need to happen, that would help inform your process?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that some of the work we're doing right now will help inform that. As we get comments back from the public, if there's things that we are not doing, we didn't nail it in our rules, and you think we need to do better, those are places where we can certainly look to implement changes in our rules. Or if processes aren't quite as smooth as they should be, some of the feedback we've received likely doesn't pertain exactly to the plan, but it's been great to be able to understand and hear the feedback, so we can try to implement changes and do better as a division. There's always going to be room to improve, so we'll keep striving to do that.
Yeah.
I have one more. So you had a list of several, I don't know, it was before the challenges slide, all the different topics that you think, yeah, there was. Just a question, and I know this is really an access issue, but to some degree, but I think both at Utah Lake and at different parts of Great Salt Lake, I think there are different visions of what major highway systems might, touch on those lakes. Will the plan, and I guess this really goes to whatever your access rules are and whatever statutes apply to how DOT does their work. Will the plan touch on that, I guess is the question.
It likely will, and there's actually a law on the books about how highways can interact with sovereign lands. So especially in regards to like public highways, we would actually need a statutory change that would happen up at the legislature in order for us to make any difference there. There's been ideas about, highways across Utah Lake that I think we all know those things are in the UDOT master plan now, or the long range plan for transportation. So those things are likely to come unless there was a statutory change up at the legislature. But as far as Great Salt Lake goes, I really wouldn't envision further expansion towards the lake. I think that the West Davis corridor has kind of set a growth boundary in my eyes. But again, there's, that law is on the books.
Yeah, my name's Cody Hart. I'm an ag producer. You mentioned something about grazing. Are you looking at some changes to the grazing along the lake by the way you said that and kind of ended?
No, not in the way that we do grazing. And as far as grazing goes, we'd be talking about like actually on sovereign lands. So when we graze on sovereign lands, it's typically to achieve a management resource need. So when we're trying to reduce Phragmites, we use grazing as a tool to achieve that. And you'll see that in the WMAs quite often. It's an alternative to having to do expensive mowing or burning or other things. And also for the long-term maintenance of the wetlands, that can be an effective way to manage. So we'll continue to use that tool. When I refer to, grazing rules or potential changes there, it'd likely be more about the process, about how we issue our grazing permits, whether we do a 15-year term or a 5-year term. Those are things we would look at. But likely the practice of grazing wouldn't change for us anytime soon. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, just the way you said grazing and then you kind of.
Oh, my apologies. We have great, I guess that's the one that's on the top of my mind is that we have really old grazing rules that I'm like, man, I really got to change, like update those and make them more clear. But they wouldn't likely, change anything that's currently ongoing. Thanks for asking that.
So it looks like you have multiple opportunities to provide comments, including right now. For this current comment period, is there a deadline or when would you like people to fill out the survey and provide comments for this first go around?
We're going to keep the survey open through the end of this year, so through December 31st. And but we are looking at them. We've had several hundred people already fill out the survey for Great Salt Lake. And I know there's, I've seen just on social media the survey link being passed around different groups, so which is fantastic. We want to get as much input as we can, and so please do pass it on, and to all your different mailing lists, email lists. It's amazing how interconnected, but how hard it is to plug into that web. So if you can help pass those along, that would be great.
Thank you to some of the influencers out there that have already done that.
Exactly. Yep. So, but I think, even when the survey is complete, I guess we hope that the input doesn't stop. And that's, we do have, on the websites, there's a place for you just to put whatever comment you want. And certainly if you feel like it bears a discussion or more, there's ways to facilitate that as well. So,
Sorry, one of the other benefits to filling out the survey, if you haven't already, is that by filling out the survey, you'll have a chance to opt into our emails and updates. And so even when we're done with the surveys, we have things to roll out. We're not going to wait till we have a draft that's like ready to publish and we're done with it. Our goal is to be able to put things out, throughout the time that we're drafting the document, and hopefully get a little bit of feedback from folks that have opted in and are interested in participating. So if you fill it out, please opt into the updates.
yes. And you can actually opt in and not do the survey, but we'd rather you do the survey option. Yeah, do the survey. So here's another question. Because I've got some questions for you if you.
I'm just curious if you can speak to the public access issue and how you're thinking about balancing the different needs, and also how that's been represented in the survey comments so far that you've read.
I haven't looked at it through the lens of the public access issue, and I haven't read all the surveys yet either, so I don't know that I can speak to it for what we've received on that end. But as far as the public access points, whether it's Utah Lake or Great Salt Lake, I think there's a real delicate balance, right? I'll use fishing as an example. I know we have folks that are interested in birds as well, but you need just enough access so you can, have that human connection with the resource, but not so much that you drive that away or deplete a resource. So we're cognizant of that. I don't know that our division necessarily holds all the answers for the potential impacts that can happen from access points. So that's where we might be looking to our partners to help decide what's appropriate. That's that kind of zoning document fill that comes into things. So for example, if we have a really critical wetland that's doing great and we know it's in great shape and we've identified that as some resource that we want to preserve and we put it in that appropriate classification, and we're looking at access points, perhaps there's kind of three categories they fall into: either allowable, not allowable, or potentially allowable. And in my eyes, access points are relatively benign, and sometimes they do belong in areas that we're trying to preserve to keep that connection, but we'd really want to evaluate the impacts. So that's what we'd do. We'd put it in that potentially allowable category, and then at that point, we'd be looking to our partners at wildlife resources, or those that have that knowledge that can help us decide if that's an appropriate use of the land. And then it goes through that whole permit process as well. That has public comment periods. We send it out to what we call the RDCC. It's an agency platform where all of the different agency partners have the ability to kind of comment under their purview. So does that get at your question? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
This is kind of a I don't know what I don't know question, but Phragmites have been mentioned 2 or 3 times, and they seem to be kind of exploding in waterways everywhere, tributaries that feed the lake as well as the lake itself. And I was not even aware that there were strategies being employed to mitigate them, because the growth just seems kind of off the charts. So I'm just kind of curious what strategies are in play. What should we know about, the options that are available to mitigate that issue? And I'm particularly interested in it too, that there's been, I think, a lot of press around, alfalfa consuming a lot of water, but then I've heard, Phragmites are kind of exponentially more impactful in the areas where they exist than anything that agriculture is dealing with. So can you just maybe give a little color on what can be done, what is being done, what should we be, as the public, be asking for, promoting, be a solution to address that issue?
I'd be happy to do that. So thanks for that question. I love to talk about this, and we have folks on our staff that love to talk about it even more than I do. So we would, if you want to dive in deep, Keith Hambrick, our restoration program manager, he does both the invasive species treatment and the restoration afterwards. But in general, our viewpoint is that Phragmites is an invasive species that really doesn't belong on sovereign lands, and if we had it our way, we'd wipe it off these lakes, right? They don't provide a lot of ecological value. They use more water than their native counterparts. All the things that you mentioned are reasons we want to get rid of it. They also outcompete their native counterparts. So we're actively treating Phragmites. We use a lot of different methods to treat Phragmites. Unfortunately, Phragmites isn't something we can go out and pull by the root and get rid of. So we do use herbicides. We're very selective where we use that and how often we use that, and we try to be very intentional with that use, because we do recognize that there's consequences of overuse of herbicides. So we do that in conjunction with burning, mowing, grazing. We also do a whole lot of restoration on the tail end to try to establish native vegetation that can compete with that. There's also areas where Phragmites is not appropriate, like the playa, where we have critical habitat for other birds and things, where we've tried to establish restoring the playa back to its original foundation. The Phragmites also it changes the course of the water as it enters the wetlands. It actually raises the level of the lake bed by, through its roots and stolons. I've heard there's about 70% of the biomass is in its roots. So it's really changing the way the water moves through the system. So that's been a big target that we've looked at on improving the situation at Great Salt Lake and Utah Lake. And we've worked with our partners like Utah Lake Authority, Utah County, Utah Lake, and we've seen a 70% reduction in Phragmites coverage around the lake, and actually probably more than that at this point. It's probably more like 80. Yep, it's probably more like 80% or so. And so we're seeing great reductions, but as it gets, as we have less coverage, it gets harder to manage when you're doing it all over the place. So that's, again, where like grazing can be really effective as we transition outside of that herbicide use and try to get the native plants to compete. We have to look into the toolbox and dig deep. On Great Salt Lake, it's primarily along the eastern shoreline where we have the wetlands and the main tributaries coming in. And there we've either treated or have plans to treat in the next 2 years every acre of Phragmites on the eastern shoreline that's on sovereign land. So we have made some strides, and we've actually treated more acres in the last year than we did in the previous 5 years. And I could be making those numbers up a little bit, but it's really close to that. So we're doing a lot more now today than we were over the past decade. So we've had more funding, more support, and more partnerships across the board. So a lot of folks helping out with this. It's not just our division. We have partners. I would try to name them all, and I'd probably miss someone, so I won't. But just to name a few, the Lake Authority, the county with Utah County, and then also the Division of Wildlife Resources has been a tremendous partner. And then the Water Trust has supported some great wetland projects as well. So we've had some really good progress and hope to continue with that.
I think you mentioned waterways too, and I think, Ben, what you were alluding to that is, I mean, the Great Salt Lake and Utah Lake are where we saw the immense monocultures, just huge thousands of acres of Phragmites. I think that's where they've been, they've done a lot of research to develop the methods, and then found the money and have been and taken care of those huge areas, and now are starting to turn into the waterways, and looking at the Jordan River and looking at, because like you said, they're along all of our canals, they're along our creeks, everywhere. And so and it has been said, it's one thing to use helicopters and big tractors and everything to take care of huge areas. It's another thing if you're dealing with a little ditch, and it probably takes as much effort. It's just a much smaller area.
Do you mind? One other just quick comment on that. Just this week, our restoration program manager was telling me that he had several canal companies reaching out to him saying like, hey, we were told you're the guy that's, kind of written the handbook on this Phragmites stuff. Can you help us out on our canal? And I thought that was so cool that we're, not only has he helped develop the methodology with Karn Kettenring from Utah State, they've written white papers and kind of developed that, but also that we're at a point where we've seen enough reduction on Great Salt Lake and Utah Lake that now we're looking up, upstream, and we're looking at the canals, the other tributaries. We've got funding with the Jordan River Commission that we're looking at how do we tackle this issue on like really difficult areas like the banks of these rivers. Like that's a lot different when you can't get in there with a mower, or a helicopter, and you have homes that are right, 30 feet from the bank. Like this is going to be a tricky endeavor, but I'm really confident that we have the tools to do the job, and we've got the folks that can really figure that out. So it's I think that's one of our division's great success stories, actually.
Great question. So I guess one question I have for all of you is just, you can see the focus areas that we have there. We want to make sure, and I think this is one of our key goals from the public, these public meetings, is we want to hear from you as what issues are of most concern to you. And they might or might not be listed here, but that's the kind of input that we want to make sure, because in my mind we're looking at all of the different resources of these lakes, how they're being used by as many, we're trying to understand how they're being used by everybody. We're trying to take that box of puzzle pieces and getting them on the table and trying to make sure that we have all the pieces on the table and we haven't dropped anything off. And so that's where I think you can help, whether it's through the survey or if you have some comments now. We want to make sure we have, if there are any other issues that you might come to mind right now, that we should make sure we address. Yeah, over here.
I'm Claire Stamfer. I'm a member of the Great Salt Lake Audubon, and I'm a citizen.
Yeah.
In terms of water quality, will you also be directly addressing the need to keep from developing new exposure of lake bed, which may contain metals which would be toxic to human health, or just small particulates which contribute to small particulate air pollution, which also is not good for human health?
Mm-hmm. So just to clarify, are you referring to discharges to the lake, or are you talking about the contaminants that are already in the lake bed and the sediments, or the emissions from the sediments?
Well, whatever's in the sediment.
Okay.
However it got there.
Yep. So I think, I know Forestry, Fire, and State Lands works directly with Department of Environmental Quality on that. And the Commissioner's Office is working, has a number of researchers, federal and state agencies, working to understand those issues. I think when it comes to our comprehensive management plan, we're trying to assess, when we see changes such as lake level, if the lake level drops, what we've observed is we see more exposed lake bed. And so what does that mean? What kinds of risks does that present? And then what are some of the kinds of things that Forestry, Fire, and State Lands needs to be aware of so that they can manage and coordinate the different uses around the lake? So I think if and when, decisions are made, I think it's a relatively simple exercise for us to map out how much exposed area there is at a given water level. I think understanding how much dust can be emitted from those exposed areas and what are the key drivers of those, that's what the research is being done, as well as the risks if dust is coming off or when dust is coming off the lake. I think those are two important questions. But I think I know another area of research that they're doing is what are the measures that we would have to undertake if, to be able to reduce those emissions for a given lake level. And so I think those are the elements that we're going to have to touch on in this plan, is just to, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands doesn't have jurisdiction over regulating air emissions. But they would have oversight over activities that would happen on the lake to mitigate for those. And so they would need to understand, what those options are, what are the potential impacts from that, and then also just, what are there other measures that we can take? Are there ways, where we can take the water that we have and manage it better? To reduce those emissions. So there's a lot of touch points, from landowners next to the sovereign lands to the people who are managing the water that's coming onto the lake, at all these dozens and dozens of points, to what the activities on the lake bed itself, and just trying to coordinate all those activities in a way that for forestry's job is to make sure that they protect the resources of the lake, when that's being done, but also to have the foresight to think, okay, if the lake is low and we do have dust emissions, what kinds of processes does forestry need to go through to be able to kind of help shepherd and coordinate those efforts?
Add to that. So I'd love to give you a couple of examples also that I think could work its way into the plan for things like that. I think that's a great topic because that's at the top of everybody's mind who lives around the Great Salt Lake. And one of the things that I think, like as Jeff said, we don't have direct authority to, regulate emissions or, do some of these things. That, we have the Division of Air Quality who's going to look at some of these things. But how can we help the Division of Air Quality when they find out that the emissivity of the lake is, a huge issue for air quality? And I think there's things that we can look at, like, okay, so say that we identify a hot spot and there's something we can do with vegetation. Perhaps it's reestablishing a certain type of vegetation like inland salt grass or something that has ecological habitat, but also helps control dust. Those are opportunities that we'll be looking for to figure out where our activities, the things that we do have in our purview, can overlap with our partners and we can achieve both of our goals, knowing that we don't necessarily regulate air quality. Also, as the lake drops, we'll look at things like, okay, if there's exposed lake bed, it's illegal to drive on the lake bed. So perhaps there's places where we can up our activity and make sure that there's the appropriate signs are there, the gates are in order, and we make sure people don't have access to the lake bed to go break the crust. And those are things that I think are really important, as managers of the lake, to be able to look at those, potential risk points and try to find those opportunities. So those are things that we'd be looking at. But if you have other ideas, again, this is a great place where you can put your ideas into the comments and let us know if you have any thoughts on how we could also contribute to that as well, because we do recognize that problem for sure.
Any other thoughts? Jamie, right? Soren's right there.
Thanks. It's good to see you this evening. Soren Simonson with the Jordan River Commission. I just want to register as part of this a thought. We've been working around the Jordan River, which is where I work professionally, on creating buffers and protecting floodplains and developing natural lands for recreation and wildlife habitat. We're often around the river looking at, hundreds of feet, but around the lakes, probably more so around Great Salt Lake than Utah Lake, there are really critical ecosystems, as you know, and there are, I used to be involved with local government in Salt Lake City, was on the city council there when there was a lot of push to develop what has become the inland port. And I remember 15 years ago pushing to try and get Salt Lake City to develop preservation tools because there's a lot of private property and there's rights associated with that. But there are a lot of tools for preserving, and there are a lot of areas that are affected by development pressure, and that is affecting the lake in some really critical ways. Wetlands are protected, especially jurisdictional wetlands, but the uplands that are often associated with them and connected with ecosystems are often seen as prime development. And so something that I would love to get registered on, at least the Great Salt Lake Management Plan, maybe it applies to Utah Lake to a degree as well, is really looking at critical wetland, upland, lake, tributary areas, and looking at the connectedness of ecosystems, and even looking at upland areas that are connected parts of that ecosystem as important preservation opportunities. There's probably 30 or 40 jurisdictions at least of cities and counties around the Great Salt Lake that each have their own approach to zoning and land use and things like that, but establishing some priorities as part of a management plan and say, look, we really ought to be protecting a large area for ecosystem health and maybe for recreation use as well, but certainly for the health of the ecosystem that's connected to the lake. So I'd love to see that included as part of this management plan, some guidelines, some recommendations and best practices for local governments, so they become partners rather than a lot of people are concerned about this just continuous encroachment further and further up to the flood line, basically, that could have really harmful consequences in the future.
Yeah, no, that's a great comment, and those are yes, that's exactly the kind of input we want to get, because we recognize that this plan has specific goals. Forestry not only needs to do it, but they need the information to be able to manage things better. But how can we coordinate with the efforts of others and the systems that are there? As you were talking, I don't remember what they were called, but I think about 20 years ago there were a number of shoreline wetland plans that were completed. I think Salt Lake County had one. I know that was completed. I think Tooele County had one. And I think the goal was to do them all the way, at least up the East Shore. But I think it had a lot of that information. What is the land use? What are those natural resources of those wetlands and uplands along the lake? And then how do we protect them? How do we manage development in those areas?
An example right now, so back in 2022, Salt Lake County the county council adopted a plan for the south shore of Great Salt Lake within the county. They call this large area the shoreline heritage area, and identify preservation of that. An area around the Jordan River, right on the Salt Lake Davis County line, is currently being annexed into Salt Lake City and being rezoned into manufacturing district. And so even when the county has, an approach to some preservation, it gets annexed in and it becomes another warehouse district and just continues to further erode and fracture. So it's happening in real time right now in some really concerning ways.
Yeah.
And so I think that would be a great area of focus and opportunity with a lot of that development pressure. I know I heard Ben Hart say the inland port hasn't rezoned any property. They're developing properties that have already been zoned by cities and counties. And I know they get a lot of flack from people that are concerned, but they're following local land use regulations. And so it's this patchwork of local governments that I think probably need to be really encouraged and developed as partners in creating best practices.
Yeah, and understanding, I think with the plan, acknowledging those linkages with the ecosystems, the land uses that are there, but also communicating with those jurisdictions that are upstream outside of the meander line per se. So that's a great comment. Sam.
Thanks. I'm Sam with Utah Lake Authority. One thing I think Jeff and I were talking about before the meeting started, I think could be interesting to include in this management plan would be an emphasis in outreach and education, not only around the plan, but around sovereign lands and other things to do with these water bodies. We've seen that a lot at Utah Lake, and I've heard that across other water bodies. Our staff attended a national lake management conference recently, and it was amazing to me just how pervasive that issue is of people not understanding the resources and how they operate and how they can interact with them as well. So I think that'd be an interesting element to include in the CMP.
Yeah, no, that's one comment that we've had just from the previous Great Salt Lake CMP was, it's almost a 200-page section of the CMP that just described the resources. And, those who are interested in the resources, that's, what we've been hearing is that that's where they go to learn about it. And, we're going to be reviewing that and seeing how we can adapt that for these plans. But I think the understanding, making that information available and, so that's a passive education opportunity for people to learn as they want to. But I think what you're adding to that is, how can we incorporate, more of an active outreach or education element? Where does that fit in? So, great. Any other issues? Holly, is there anything online? Oh.
We just got a comment that agrees with Sam and that there could be a potential focus area in the plan for increased education is also with schools or social media, and that's for both lakes.
Great. All right, John, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm John Mackey, Division of Water Quality. One of the things that I'm always curious about is the financial component to plans. I know that you mentioned, Ben, that sometimes there's needs and the legislature is asked to fulfill those, but in some cases there's going to be ongoing, right, as well as one time. But is there a financial component where you might look at long range needs for funding, ongoing funding?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the plan will not likely, I don't think we'll probably go in as detailed as like dollar amounts and specific requests. There may be an identification or a linkage to like a strategic plan that we'll develop, and I think that's how I envision this plan being more adaptive. Is that we have the overall big objectives up here, and they trickle down to things like a salinity management plan that can be referenced in here, right? Like we all want to be able to manage salinity, and we know that's going to change. We're going to evolve. Like we'll probably change that plan 5 times over the next decade because we're still learning so much. We're getting new tools every day. We're looking into like how we can manage the berm better and other tools to do that. So we want to be able to link to those things. Same things with other specific resources like the Keith Hambrecht, who I've mentioned, has done some invasive species remediation. He's been working on strategic plans for some of the bays with the WMA managers to figure out like what is it going to look like for the next 5 years to manage the vegetation and restore some of these wetlands. So as far as the funding goes, I think as we have the overall objectives and then we can get down into the strategies and the implementation of those plans, we can identify those long-term funding needs. And again, we would have to go up to the legislature, as you very well know, working with water quality to ask for those funds or go do it through the governor's budget to do that. So we would look at long-term funding if it's necessary, if there's items that we would need or that get identified in this plan or the strategic plans to follow.
Answer your question?
Yeah, if I could just have one follow-up. So I know that with infrastructure under HB 280, they're looking at different long-term funding mechanisms, taxation, for example. Any component of looking at just mechanisms for sustaining?
Yeah. So
management?
I get what you were asking. So right now, currently, our primary funding source is from mineral extraction on Great Salt Lake. That's a lot of the funding that we get to put back into the resources. As far as, we don't have taxation authority and, those other things that might, we really don't want it, actually. I think that what I was going to say is we would actually love to just continue to defer to like the commissioner's office. I know he's working on different funding sources that can provide a long-standing source of funding for the lake, and they've got a slew of different ideas that I think could help support our division's goals, water quality's goals. I think it's really important that we have a pot of funding that's dedicated to Great Salt Lake and to Utah Lake. But I don't know that our division will pursue something like that. I think we'll probably pursue that bucket when it gets established or what we currently have available to us at this point.
Great. We all need more money, right? There's lots of issues to resolve. Any other questions? I guess, are there any ideas on what we could do better? Even as we're developing this plan, I think a number of you have worked on your own plans, have been involved with other plans. We're trying to do this as effectively as we can in the time we have. So, any ideas that you might have on how we can do things better as part of this planning process, or even as you observe all the interactions that are currently occurring with each of the lakes. Any ideas or questions there? Because those are all, I think, outreach and education is a great example of, that's an area where, I think we can always do more there. But that certainly feeds into awareness and can certainly improve how how people use these lakes. And appreciate them. But interactions between agencies, any thoughts there?
One question I would have for group is, if we look at the last, if we look at the last 10 years and all the changes that have happened, as you kind of look ahead to the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, are there changes that you would anticipate that would be good to start thinking about and addressing in the plans today with both lakes? So as you kind of think about what are potential trends in recreation, land use, development, or whatever it might be that maybe we're not thinking about today that we should be thinking about.
I also just want to make sure too that we don't put you all on the spot. I think these are a lot of questions that we wanted to pose that you can go, think through. This is a lot to take in, at 7:22 on a Wednesday evening. So hopefully, as we're talking about some of these things, it kind of seems like everybody's getting a little bit tuckered out on the questions. But I think if you can reflect a little bit on that and fill out that survey or provide those comments, or if you have any epiphanies between now and Christmas, we would love for you to even if you have to fill out the survey twice or email me or Emily, we really want to hear from you on those things. So please don't forget about this. And as we push out, more information, we'll hope that you continue to give us feedback. But I know Jeff may have some more things to say, but I just want to say thank you so much for being here late on a Wednesday. I know most of you are doing this as an additional item to your day jobs. I see a lot of folks that I work with every day that came out tonight, and then other folks that just volunteer your time. So thanks again for caring so much about the resources that we manage and supporting us in our mission. It means a lot to have you all here and participating. So, and we'll look forward to seeing your comments and engaging with you over the next almost year and a half that we'll be working on this. So thanks again.
And I'll echo that. Thank you very much. If you have anything else, please grab one of us, and we'll be here. There's posters. I do want to say all of this information can be found on the website. And we recorded the presentation here tonight, and that will put a link on the website here in the next day or two. So if you care to watch it again, you can, or pass it on to others who you think might be interested. Yeah, it's riveting. But anyway, thank you so much for coming out tonight, and really appreciate your time and interest and involvement. So thank you. Good night.